The Dynamics of War Insanity, NATO's Ukraine Roulette. This is written by a diplomacy professor of Geneva. The West is not playing the classic Russian roulette. It has developed its own version, Ukrainian roulette, compulsive apocalyptic va-banque by Jonas Alexis. Now, deliberate provocations of nuclear rival, coup d'etat, color revolutions, broken promises, broken treaties, escalation of tensions, demonization, invective, double standards, all this while asserting adherence to international legal norms and playing innocent about our aggressions or violations of the Hague and Geneva Conventions of Articles 1, 2, and 39 of the UN Charter. Abrams tanks, Leopard tanks, F-16, indiscriminate weapons, depleted uranium, cluster bombs. Summits illustrate how the moral compass of the collective West is lost in the avalanche of fake news, fake history, laud, bellicose rhetoric, media hyperbole, serial mobbing of dissidents, persecution of whistleblowers, and censorship. The Western binary mindset continues to divide the world into good and bad countries, democracies, and autocracies. There's a little room to accommodate a comprehensive picture of the prehistory, root cause of conflicts and nuances. One observes an almost total absence of a sense of proportions. The global majority in Latin America, Africa, and Asia is increasingly alarmed by the surrealistic spectacle of a collective West that seems out of control, developing its own lethal dynamic, displaying a paroxysm of Russophobia and Sinophobia, incitement to hatred, cancel culture, refusal to entertain serious dialogue, doubling down on eschatological demands. Many non-Western thinkers and politicians are articulating justified warnings that the ongoing intestinal conflicts in the West are adversely impacting the economies of third world countries and may ultimately result in the apocalypse for the entire planet. The West is not playing classical Russian roulette. It's developed its own version, Ukrainian roulette, compulsive apocalypse va-banque. Meanwhile, the Western media, notably Reuters, AP, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, Le Monde, Figaro, Faz, Der Spiegel, and even the Swiss NZZ ensure the daily indoctrination doses of the Western public, purveying skewed narratives that repeat and embellish what Washington and Brussels ordain, blithely ignoring other views and perspectives and the principle audiatur et altera pars. Now, freedom of the media in the collective West seems to mean the right to repeat NATO narratives ad nauseum, even when they have been proven wrong. This freedom, quote unquote, also includes the freedom to ignore every critical voice about NATO and to refrain from asking critical questions at NATO press conferences. Western media systematically fail to report on the fears of billions of human beings in the rest of the world, Brazilians, Mexicans, South Africans, Ugandans, Indians, Chinese, who want peace and stability in the world, as well as a chance for sustainable development. Many of these countries blame not Russia, but Washington and Brussels for provoking the Ukraine conflict. This global majority is not interested in whether Crimea lies in Russia or Ukraine. They demand peaceful solution to an internal Western strife so that the spillover does not dislocate the economies of non-Western countries. Peace must be sought and achieved at the negotiation table and not on the battlefield. The power of propaganda on the legal, moral, and political arenas. Truth is less important than the perception of truth. Since time immemorial, language has shaped our perception of reality, coloring it according to the political agenda of the powerful. Propaganda was not invented in the 21st century. It has always existed and generated an opportunistic pseudo-reality, an epistemology that subverts our understanding of facts and events. Labels, caricatures, and generalizations serve as shortcuts to judge and influence our daily behavior in making choices. We're not obliged to use these templates, but most people unthinkably do so. The narrative marriage managers of the mainstream media are bent on persuading us into believing who is good and who is bad, what politicians we should like, whom we should despise, and what metaphysic we should consider when valid when mainstream with the mainstream epistemology. And of course, we still have our own brains and can use them. As Horatio used to say, the said thing is that even highly educated persons, graduate of Harvard, Oxford, and Sciences Po, continue to put their trust in media outlets that do not deserve our trust. As Julius Caesar put it, quo valumus e credemus libenter. We believe what we want to believe. Indeed, it takes temerity to realize that our own politicians and media lie to us, that they are purveyors of disinformation and practitioners of Orwellian doublethink. The human being has an innate desire to believe in a positive metaphysic, wants to look up to some authority, and needs to have benchmarks and orientation points, and that is why we are all, to some degree, negotiationists and resilient to bad news. In spite of the egregious official disinformation that preceded Western aggressions in Vietnam, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, we still want to believe that our governments are really champions of the rule of law and human rights, that they mean well, even if occasionally they inadvertently make mistakes. Of course, it's painful to accept that some things that affect us are ugly, but the realization actually opens new vistas if we reject blind faith in our leaders and practice a healthy skepticism. If we proactively look for other views and perspectives, we grow up, become mature, and experience a sense of liberation from illusions, acquiring a new purpose based on the facts as they stand and not as we would like them to be. The function of law. Law has an epistemological function in defining what is allowed and what is reprehensible. Law is not immutable or God-given, but constitutes a codification of rules of the game at a particular moment in time and in a particular context. Law should not be confused with justice. Law is only the expression of certain order of things. Past and future generations and other civilizations may have entirely different legal orders and different ideas as to what justice entails. Education teaches us to respect certain red lines established by the scribes of our society, the lawmakers in parliaments, in the United Nations, the international conferences such as those organized by international committees of the Red Cross, which have concretized the ius in bello, the laws of war. These codifications include the rejection of indiscriminate weapons such as landmines and cluster bombs, the International Convention banning cluster munitions, 123 signatories, 111 state parties, of 3rd December 2008 was signed by many states that now consider furnishing cluster bombs to Ukraine. So go figure. Judges apply the laws that have been codified in institutions possessing law-making authority, and this is what we like to call the rule of law, which must not be confused with the rule of justice. Moreover, the rule of law is systematically undermined when the legal profession engages in brazen double standards and international tribunals like the International Criminal Court practice selectively, investigating only some crimes while letting the crimes committed by Western countries go unpunished. Criminal organizations. Article 9 and 10 of the London Agreement of August 8, 1945, the Statute of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, as well as the Nuremberg Judgment of 1 October 1946, created a precedent for a previously uncodified crime, membership in a criminal organization, quote unquote. Several Nazi organizations, including the SS, the Gestapo, and the Reich Cabinet, were found to be criminal organizations, a problematic concept that flies in the face of the legal principle of presumption of innocence. If we fast forward to the 21st century and consider the activities of the CIA, MI6, and Mossad, targeting assassinations and overt and covert actions in violation of the Hague and Geneva Conventions, what is the relevance of the Nuremberg precedent to these organizations and to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization itself? If we compile the evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by NATO forces over the past 30 years, this would largely suffice for the International Criminal Court to issue indictments for violations of Article 7, crimes against humanity, and 8 war crimes of the Statute of Rome. Initially, NATO has been raison d'etre under its 1949 treaty, but the moment that the Warsaw Pact was dismantled in 1991, this justification fell away, and it gradually morphed into an imperialistic hegemonic military bloc bent on imposing the Weltanschauung of the collective West on the rest of the world. While Chapter 8 of the UN Charter recognizes the legitimacy of regional arrangements, Article 52 to 54, in the field of collective security, this requires that these regional arrangements be subordinate to the higher authority of the Security Council, which has a monopoly over the legal use of force. Since the 1990s, NATO has conspired to usurp the functions of the Security Council and thus gotten away with it. Although the NATO treaty must yield to the primacy of the UN Charter, pursuant to Article 103 of the Charter, the Supremacy Clause, if states are dissatisfied with the current state of international law, it's for them to seek an amendment to the UN Charter pursuant to Article 108. Undoubtedly, it was contrary to the UN Charter for NATO countries to use military force against Yugoslavia in 1999, in the absence of a Security Council resolution under Chapter 8 and a finding under Article 39 of the chapter that there had been a previous threat or breach of international peace and security and a failure of peaceful negotiations under the auspices of the United Nations. Without approval by the Security Council, NATO's actions in Yugoslavia and elsewhere were simply illegal and engaged state civil and penal responsibility, including the obligation to pay reparations to the victims of the aggression. NATO actions since the entry into the force of the Statute of Rome in 2001 deserves to be investigated under the rubric Crime of Aggression, Article 5 of the Rome Statute, as complemented by the Kampala definition of aggression, and of course under Articles 7 and 8. The end never justifies the means. The Florentine diplomat Niccolò Machiavelli never wrote the phrase, "the end justifies the means," in his famous book, The Prince. However, the thrust of the entire book is precisely that. Throughout the ages, wielders of power have always claimed that because their goals were supposedly noble, the means to achieve those ends should be allowed. The same idea is expressed in the common idiom that you cannot make an omelette without cracking some eggs. But this is a lame excuse. What must be understood is that evil means contaminating the end and rendering it evil as well. Politicians and media in the collective West try to justify the unjustifiable, including the delivery of indiscriminate weapons to Ukraine, covering up the U.S. involvement in the blowing up of Nord Stream pipelines, the responsibility of Ukraine for the bombing of Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and the Kharkova Dam and other dams. Politicians and media systematically engage in apologetics about the war crimes committed by NATO forces. Beyond merely whitewashing the crimes, they engage in a form of totalitarian censorship and practice a vicious persecution of whistleblowers who tell us what crimes are being committed in our name. Indeed, secrecy is an enabler of crime. Few people know that the Holocaust, the great crime of the 20th century, was largely perpetrated under cover of secrecy. Now, that is why there was Nazi Operation 1005 to attempt to erase evidence of and digging up graves, and why most concentration camps in the East were evacuated and destroyed before their capture by the Soviet Army. Secrecy and denial were indispensable elements of the criminal conspiracy. UN rapporteur Niels Meslich's book, The Trial of Julian Assange, documents the egregious violations of the rule of law in the US, UK, Sweden, and Ecuador in connection with the Assange frame-up and prosecution. Indeed, Niels Melzer is the Emile Zola of the 21st century, demonstrating far worse judicial misconduct than Zola revealed in the 1890s in connection with the frame-up of Alfred Dreyfus by a French military court. The Assange scandal is much worse than the Dreyfus affair. But the mainstream media today has totally failed in its watchdog duty, and many journalists have even joined the wolves. What future for NATO? Professors like John Mearsheimer, Richard Falk, Jeffrey Sachs, Stephen Kinzer, and others have expressed their concern about the dangers that NATO poses for the survival of humanity, of the logic that it should be dismantled. The best that could be hoped for is that NATO be phased out and that the global majority will succeed in rejecting NATO's ambition to further expand not only in Europe but also in the Asian Pacific region. Perhaps the global majority exposes the multiple war crimes of NATO forces over the past 30 years and demands accountability from NATO countries. The perception of NATO as a defense alliance will be replaced by the label criminal organization. When the media indoctrination and propaganda about NATO is exposed as false, when the perception in Western countries moves from positive to negative, and when people realize that NATO is a Machiavellian institution that has exhausted its usefulness, it will be possible to gradually wind it down. Ultimately, NATO must be recognized not only as a criminal organization, a blustering vestige of a moribund Western imperialism, but as a mortal danger to the survival of civilization on Earth. NATO is on the wrong side of history. And this is on Veterans Today by Alfred de Zayas, law professor, Geneva School of Diplomacy, who served as UN independent expert on international order 2012 to 2018. He's the author of 10 books, including Building a Just World Order from Clarity Press 2021. I'll leave links below for you for this. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.